Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Standards. Oh my goodness, these things, they seem like they're changing and evolving all the time. And it seems like it's impossible to kind of keep up with what's going on. I mean, are you up to speed with the latest, greatest on IEC 60601? What about the FDA CDRH standards program? Do you know what's going on with that? And what about the updates to the standards database and this new ASCA program, pilot program that FDA will be rolling out? Oh my goodness, so much going on in this space. And then that's why I'm thrilled to have Scott Colburn with FDA and Leo Eisner with Eisner Safety Consultants on this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host, the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, John Spear. And I'm pretty excited about this podcast because, you know, it addresses a topic that, my goodness, it's confusing for those of us in the medical device industry trying to bring new products to market and you know, align with all of these standards and guidances out there. So I have two experts on today's podcast, and we're going to talk about the latest updates on CDRH standards program and IE 60601 series. So joining me today, I have Leo Eisner. Leo is the principal product safety and regulatory consultant at Eisner Safety Consultants. I refer to Leo as the IEC 60601 guy, so you can call him that too. So Leo, welcome.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. It's good to be back.
All right. And I also have joining us Captain Scott Colburn. Scott is the Director of Standards and Conformity Assessment Program at FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So Scott, welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
All right. And I thought we would just dive in because, you know, like I've been doing this for a long time. And even though that's the case, I still get twisted and tied up and confused from time to time on standards. And, you know, one of the biggies, especially for a lot of products out there these days is this 60601 standard. I know, Leo, you know, you've got that standard memorized. You know, I don't know how many pages it is today, but I know you're the world's expert on that standard. But you mentioned that there's a draft of 60601-1 edition 3.2, along with some additional collateral standards in the works. Can you talk about what's going on with this standard and all the ancillary parts and pieces to it?
Sure, John. Appreciate that. There's a couple things I need to sort of define up front before I get into the details a little bit, because otherwise I'll be repeating long terms and stuff. So one thing is we have a shortlist project, which is now also called the Amendments Project. These are the issues that are being dealt with the draft that you just mentioned, edition 3.2 or third edition with Amendment 2. And all the associated collaterals. Collaterals, for those that don't know, are 60601-1-XX, like 1-2 is EMC, 1-6 is usability. Then there's the long list project, which will be the fourth edition of 601-1. And yes, that's way in the future. It's probably 2024 or later when it starts officially. Then there's lots of acronyms, which I will try to explain as I go through things. So the progress goes back to 2015. In Kobe, Japan, we met, and 62A, which is the subcommittee under TC 62, which is the technical committee or the mothership, issued a resolution. In that resolution, the basic concept was, how are we going to figure out, of these 500 plus issues that have been collected, what the criteria is for the short list versus long list projects? And that was a long process. Also, how are we going to vote as national committees? And lots of other details. Jumping forward a little bit, in Daytona, Florida, the CAG, the Chairman's Advisory Group for 62A, which I'm not on, the members of the CAG reviewed these 500 plus items and tried to do a baseline sort. These are short list project. This is long list. Then we had to go to the national committees. And in Frankfurt, about October of 2016, 62A had a meeting and we had a live vote. Took a day and a half to go through those 500 plus items. We took 2 to 3 minutes per item to vote. It was insane. The applicable maintenance teams and working groups out of that vote were determined for the shortlist project, and we were on our way to writing the first committee draft, which is the first step in the process for existing standards.
So what you're telling me is writing a standard takes quite a bit of time, effort, and energy, and pulling a lot of resources together.
That is an understatement. And one thing that's really bad about standards development that I see is a lot of graying of the brain trust, and there's not a lot of replacement on the front end. So we're losing people, not gaining people in a lot of cases, because a lot of companies can't afford to have someone go to all these meetings. You know, there's the AME cost, the ANSI cost for US membership to be on the committees. And then there's all the travel costs and the time and the expertise outside the meeting and inside the meeting. So it's very expensive for companies. And it's a challenge for me too, since I'm self-supported.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously standards, they change from time to time, and I assume many times standards are changing to kind of keep up with state of the art. But Leo, do you have some idea or can you provide some explanation for why are we seeing the changes to the 601-1 and the collaterals? Why is this happening now?
The basic reasoning is that we did Amendment 1 of third edition, came out in 2012. And that was to update third edition because there were a lot of confusing aspects of it. When Amendment 1 is significantly better than third edition. And I always say that, and I think FDA has agreed to that, and OSHA agrees with that a lot. So back at the end of 2015, the Secretariat said, we're cutting off all issues input at that point, and we're going to start looking at what is Amendment 2, because we wanted to start planning things. So the line was drawn in the sand for the shortlist project for issues coming in. Other than there's a couple that have been added in since, but those were urgent issues. The inputs submitted to the Secretariat included content generated. Every 5 years, we do a systemic review of the standards. So we did the general standard 60601-1 and the collateral standards. And that was done by the national committees giving input into the voting system in IEC. Then the working group, 14 recommendations were added as part of this, which is the interpretations group that have there were certain issues that were published, I think up to item 230. I'm a member of this group as well. And this is one of the working groups in the shortlist project. Then issues were collected by the Secretariat, the 62A Secretariat, and also conveners over the years. And lastly, open issues since Amendment 1 work happened. The output of the national committees during the Frankfurt meeting, which I mentioned briefly, was the short list versus the long list. So the criteria for the shortlist project included 5 items: safety gaps, known problems for regulatory bodies, inconsistencies within the 601 series of standards, especially the general and collateral is what the shortlist project's focused on, technical errors, and update of key standard references. And the line in the sand for the long list project hasn't been set yet.
I see. All right. So Scott, I'm always, curious too. I mean, obviously, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always great to hear, the agency's perspective on these types of topics as well. And I know there's been a ton of work. I'm sure you've been very involved, and your team's been very involved in the consensus standards database and information. But Are there any policy updates on the appropriate use and recognition of these voluntary consensus standards at FDA?
Yeah, John, there's been really a whole series of updates, and I'll walk through some of them, but I want to echo Leo's sentiment about, the importance of standards cannot be understated. And, from a regulatory agency, even just at the national level, but more importantly, when we're working with global standards, the global use of these by regulatory authorities is also paramount and very important. And that's kind of where a lot of the updates of our language that we're putting out in the appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards guidance comes from. In the end, we're really trying to show that, our agency really values voluntary consensus standards because of the consistency, the predictability, and the credibility that they give towards making science-based decisions, which helps support how do standards fit into a regulatory agency's ability to make an appropriate regulatory decision that's designed around patient safety. And so all these things of how standards are developed really become a key aspect to this. One of the things we really want to show is, we are committed into ensuring that standards are of high quality and can be used towards regulatory purposes. And FDA is one of the leading fronts in doing this in the medical device sector, but in general, just in how government participates in standards. We sit on over 660 different committees and working groups, both at the national and international level. We have over 350 expert liaisons just in CDRH alone that sit on those committees on a number of different specialties and different standard developing organizations across all the different modalities and processes that you can imagine. So it's quite a commitment. And to Leo's point, it takes a lot of work, and we see that in the development of these processes and products. And because of that, we also want to be a part of the ability to help lead some of these and work with our stakeholders across both industry and academia, as well as the patient advocates that are a part of this process. So it becomes very important. To give you kind of an outline of what our guidance document is about, it really stems right off from the roots of what the program was designed under the Food and Drug Modernization Act back in 1997. Which gave us that authority to formally recognize a standard, either in all or in part, and added the ability for us to accept a formal declaration of conformity to recognize standards. And that becomes very important because that allows us to have a dialogue with our sponsors by saying, we feel pretty confident about these standards and we'll accept the declaration of conformity with the appropriate supplementary information as dictated by the standards, scope and the way the test methods and results that are indicated in such standards. To give us that opportunity to lower the regulatory burden, but also lessen the burden to our sponsors on how they describe how they met certain aspects of testing, and to give us just that nice, confidence in the fact that they are using these standards to help outline a bigger picture towards the safety and performance aspects of their devices. The 21st Century Cures Act in 2016 gave us a really big lift in the ability for us to communicate a little bit more about what does it mean when a standard is recognized. And what they win is it allows us to now communicate our determination and rationale and purpose for why we are recognizing standards, whether it's a complete standard, but more importantly, if there's a part of a standard that we don't recognize, we're allowed to describe a little bit about what is it that prevents us from recognizing that complete standard that we could communicate to a user of that standard, so we have a better chance of getting that first-time testing correct without going back and forth for additional informations or clarifications. And so 21st Century Cures allowed us to do that. It also made sure that we are training our staff on the appropriate use of standards, as well as providing industry the right pieces of information and education so they understand how to utilize our program. And so the agency is unveiling a series of different CDRH Learn modules online, as well as updating guidance documents and doing outreach activities such as this to just try to inform all of our stakeholders, including our sister agencies within the U.S. and sister FDA CDRHs across different countries and regulatory authorities, who all kind of work together to try to improve our overall use of standards. So to really try to get to the meat of what are some of the big changes that were done, going to the whole foundation of what's in our recognition database, we have what's called supplementary information sheets. And these are documents that we have, one for each standard that's recognized, that lists the pertinent information to help a sponsor as well as review staff to understand how does that standard fit into its support towards the declaration of conformity as outlined by FDA's recognition. And what we've done with the 21st Century Cures and the appropriate use guidance is added in a few things to help make it a little bit easier for a sponsor to figure out, is this standard the appropriate standard for us to use before they may even have a chance to purchase that standard. And so simple things like adding the scope of that standard as well as the rationale for the recognition or non-recognition of a part of a standard is being added. And, not to just only add things, but we also removed a lot of aspects from those, two additions that we felt were no longer necessary. And so we were removing certain things like what's the devices affected by the standard, what are the processes affected, or what's the type of standard. That's usually described right into the scope of a standard anyway, so it's right up front in the better defined way of which the intent of the standard was designed. And so from that, we are able to take us along and go into describing better of how the standard can apply into what we're trying to do. And I want to just highlight 3 areas that this guidance really kind of updates that changes from what we've been doing in the past to be a little bit more nimble and a little bit more efficient in how standards can be useful for both the regulatory side as well as sponsor submitting. And the first one is discussing FDA's intent to recognize a standard. In the past, we have always, waited on the publication of a Federal Register notice that sometimes comes out maybe 2 times a year. Maybe if we're lucky, we can get 3 or 4 out in a year, but it's never predictable. We never know how long it's going to take to get through all those processes. And if you really think about it, what is it that we're trying to say? We're trying to give information to the public on a voluntary program where a sponsor may choose if they wish to use a standard for which we will accept the declaration of conformity. So what the guidance now is the fact that we can, in advance of the Federal Register notice, describe our intent to recognize a standard by updating our recognition database prior to the publication of a Federal Register notice, thereby giving sponsors and staff the opportunity to utilize that standard toward the declaration of conformity before the Federal Register notice goes out. And so that becomes real important, especially when we're trying to get standards up to address public health concerns or major overarching issues like cybersecurity or certain new technologies that are coming about. And maybe just because of some administration things that are going on, Federal Register notices are being backlogged. We now can communicate to our recognition database in a much more nimble and much more efficient way the use of those standards to support a declaration of conformity. And we feel really positive that this would really help out all staff and sponsors. So the intent to recognize will be one big area. On the other side, what we have also learned through the comments that came in from our stakeholders is that, recognizing new standards and then withdrawing those older standards isn't always as easy to the manufacturer as it may seem. And while we're always trying to recognize the newest version of a standard as early as possible, we do recognize that that can have a big impact on how a sponsor is communicating the use of standards in their submissions. And therefore, what we are also instituting is transition periods for standards that are going to be withdrawn by a newer version of a standard to which it's replacing. And so what you'll start seeing now is instead of just a complete withdrawal of a standard immediately upon recognition of a newer standard, there will be a transition period that will be outlined in that outgoing standard for a period of time where both standards will be recognized. So that way, if someone's submitting a submission and it comes in on a Monday, but on Friday, those standards were removed, that submission isn't left with a bunch of declarations of conformity to standards that are no longer recognized. There will be a period of time where both of those standards will be together. The appropriate use of them will be explained so that way a manufacturer will understand how their declaration of conformity will still be able to be used, even if it is a standard that is going towards a withdrawal. So depending on the type of standard, we're looking at doing different lengths of transition periods. And in the area of 60601, sponsors that have been using those standards is familiar with this type of information because of the impact that, especially the most recent amendment, has had on the manufacturer's use of the risk management files and how that impacts the overall quality system. And so, but what we really wanted to find is where else does this impact when we do these types of withdrawals? And we found that, we need to be consistent across the board. And with that, you see where we are going towards on that. The last update I really want to talk about is how we are describing and really trying to imprint the culture of what is the declaration of conformity versus a general use of a standard. Section 514C of the Act, which our program is based upon, states that FDA will recognize standards to which we'll accept the declaration of conformity to. And I want to make sure that that's very clear in that it's not one of those we recognize standards that then we decide which ones we will accept the declaration of conformity to. The declaration of conformity is acceptable to standards that are recognized. The culture on both sides, both with sponsors and how they indicate the use of standards, as well as sometimes how regulatory authorities accept the declaration of conformity, doesn't always seem to have followed the intent of the law. The guidance resets that to ensure that, if you are utilizing a standard that is recognized by the agency and using it in accordance with that recognition, we'll accept declarations of conformity to that standard. But what we've also added is that when we speak about what is a declaration of conformity, we're speaking it into the terms of how it is actually defined in the ISO IEC standard 17050-1 and the supplemental information that is provided in the -2 of that standard. And we feel that this will allow us to get a lot more in line with how other regulatory authorities use the declaration of conformity by outlining the general requirements of what are those elements, as well as the supporting documentation to support such declarations. Because as we know, most standards do not lend themselves to just I declare conformance with standard full stop signed by the responsible individual. There's a lot of information that needs to be supporting the documentation of that declaration because of maybe different options that are employed or the endpoints of the test methods are not implicit in the standard, and a number of other potential issues. The guidance here helps outline what is the level of information that we would expect to see from the manufacturer to adequately support the declaration of conformity to a standard cited in the submission. So I think I'll hold there for updates. There are a few other things like that, but these are the main impact ones that I think are of most importance to us.
Well, I appreciate you sharing those insights. And folks, I just want to remind you that we're talking with Scott Colburn with FDA CDRH. Scott's very involved with standards and conformity assessment program at FDA, and also talking with Leo Eisner. Leo is with the Eisner Safety Consultants, and you can refer to him as the 60601 guy. But very insightful, and I always like to bring this back to why does this matter? And a lot of our listeners I know are very active in bringing new products to market, and some people I assume that they don't have an appreciation for the value that standards can play in their product development efforts. And Leo and Scott, you both have provided some insights to that. But maybe I guess kind of in that spirit, in that vein. So Leo, I'll start with you a little bit on this. So obviously you're very involved in 60601. Why should I be paying attention to what's going on with the changes to the standard as a medical device company? Why does this matter so much? I mean, I know that these things change every so often, but so what? Who cares, right?
Well, you probably would care as a design manufacturer or design developer, because as things change, that's going to affect your requirements, your product specifications, your requirements, inputs, the whole process for your design development process. So there's a bunch of changes going on in Amendment 2, and some are significant, including updating some of the normative references. So normative references are the standards that we refer to in 60601-1, for example. And so 14971, the risk management standard for all medical devices, not just electrical, is being updated currently to third edition. It looks like currently it's going to get published around December 2019. It's a rough date. That's getting referenced in Amendment 2 in the shortlist project. Same with 62304 is going through a significant change to second edition for them. And it's health software now instead of just software or medical software, I think. And there were major issues with this last CDV vote. So I heard literally in the last few days, we're talking about possibly a third committee draft, which is unusual, going anything past a second committee draft, if even doing a second committee draft. So I suspect the September 2019 publication date that they show on the website currently will shift. And depending how the shortlist project falls out, which now I heard yesterday is shifting by another 7 or 8 months. We're talking June through August of 2020 now, getting published. We might be able to still sneak in the 62304 second edition, but it depends on the timing there. Then there's usability. IEC 62366-1 will be updated as well. But for 601-1, it's just in the definitions section. It's the usability of medical electrical equipment standard that's going to reference it a lot more, which is the 60601-1-6. I know it's a mouthful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's helpful. I mean, and I think, it's you got to keep your finger on the pulse enough to know where these things are moving. But obviously some of those things that you mentioned, I mean, we're talking a year or longer before we would expect to see, these updates. And I guess, do you have any tips or advice for a medical device company who, maybe they're in the midst of product development right now, and they don't anticipate doing a submission for, let's say, 12 or 18 months from now? I mean, how important are these changes to these standards going to be to the thing that they're working on right now?
It really depends on the country that you're dealing with, how the standards apply. Because in the US and Canada, once you submit, as long as you don't change your product in the future, which you will over time, of course, you don't have to update to the most current version of the standard for that country. Like Scott said, FDA has the recognized consensus database. Health Canada has a list of standards, harmonized standards that are listed, which for 601 is so far behind state of the art, it's ridiculous. And that's a political issue that I'm not going to get into. It's not worth it today.
But that's a really good point. I mean, you talk about state of the art. I mean, by the time a standard becomes published, it's got some age to it. And so,
yes,
right?
No question about that.
But I think that's important for companies to understand who are listening to this is, a standard, at least in my very simplistic way of applying what it means, is it's an accepted practice. It's an accepted way of doing things, so to speak. And Scott, you mentioned it a couple times a moment ago about the Declaration of Conformity. And, having quite a bit of experience putting together 510Ks, pre-submissions, things of that nature in my past, I know how important that Declaration of Conformity can be. So can you maybe speak to that just a little bit?
Well, I mean, the Declaration of Conformity, by definition, is that. And it's a legal statement, it's a responsible statement, and it's showing that not only did you just take the standard and apply it to how you feel it fits, but you're also following the standard in accordance with its intent for how a declaration would be accepted. And in the United States, the Declaration of Conformity, especially in the regulatory environment, is a legal statement. It is a legal statement that is responsible by the organization who's making it, indicating that it is truthfully being done in accordance with how the outline of that standard is done. And that way it becomes a confidence relationship builder in terms of understanding how testing was conducted. Was it done in accordance with how the scope of that document was there? And how does that fit in then to the overall picture? One thing I always do say is while a declaration of conformity is paramount to how standards are used and their importance, it in and of itself is not a clearance or an approval to a product, but it does really start defining how the pieces of that puzzle are being filled in through the use of standards. And in certain product areas, and especially in the 60601 space, where we start having particulars to certain areas that do a really nice job of walking through all the essential performance and outlining the basic safety of how that device will be conducting and doing the appropriate work of how the most recent amendment applies risk management. you can get really close to describing all the necessary features of what's needed to get through your submission by the appropriate use of those standards. And your declaration of conformity is your pathway to describe how you met that standard appropriately.
Yeah, and I may take it a step further, Scott. And folks, if you have a device that you're developing, like for example, where it's an electrical medical device and you do not have a declaration of conformity to 60601 and the applicable parts and pieces that may apply to your product, it's going to do more than raise an eyebrow when it gets to an FDA reviewer. I mean, like Scott illustrated or mentioned, this is important because it is an accepted series of activities. Sometimes it even describes specific test methods that one should do to be able to demonstrate that a certain aspect has been addressed. So if your device is electrical in nature and you have not done a declaration of conformity to 60601, it's going to raise a flag.
Well, I mean, more importantly, too, what we're looking at in the use of the series is the appropriate use. If you have a collateral, that collateral standard or the particular standard, that particular standard will call out the relevant collaterals and how to use the base standard to establish your essential performance. What we want to see is how you appropriately apply that particular standard to try to really demonstrate how you've defined your basic safety and essential performance. That becomes a really important aspect because that's where the agency starts seeing variations in how a manufacturer or even a testing lab that maybe they're contracting with applies that process. And so if we get people to appropriately use the right standards and defining their criteria, it allows us to have that better understanding versus if they're just using the -1 standard and kind of not really mapping their product to how it was addressed in the use of that standard, we get a lot of variability. And of course, with that, you start seeing questions coming back, which only slows the process. And we want to try to not to do that when we're using standards. The whole idea of recognizing standards is to lower burden on both parties as much as possible to get to the areas that standards don't address.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Scott, you mentioned something a moment ago about the FDA Consensus Standards Database. And folks, this Consensus Standards Database has come a long way in recent years. So Scott, whatever role you played in that, thank you. Efforts should certainly be applauded on that. But Scott, you made a really interesting point earlier because Leo, you can tell us all about how expensive and if you were to go out and purchase standards, I mean, I wouldn't advise that because it can get very, very expensive very quickly. But I would advise going to the Consensus Standards Database as kind of that first stop to evaluate, okay, what are the recognized standards? And that 1-2-page summary that Scott referred to is really a great source for you to identify possible standards that may apply to the things that you're doing. So Leo, Scott, do you have any other tips or advice for people to try to determine which standards apply and how to go about assessing and evaluating those rather than just buying them?
Sure. This is Leo. The first thing I do a lot of times will scan the IEC and also the ISO websites, putting in terms that are common to the product, like infusion pump or infusion. Some products aren't fully infusion pumps, but I've seen clients use parts of the standard. The other is there's the guidance database in FDA, which is expensive. The search terms are a little more rigid sometimes, from what I've seen from personal use, that you might have to try multiple shots at it. And also going to the standards database on the FDA website and putting in terms that are common to your product, that are particular to your product, because there's a lot of products out there that use multiple particular standards like ECG and SPO2, et cetera, that you need to go searching through the sites, the regulators that you want to work with, the standards databases that are out there, IEC and ISO. You can see the scope of a standard And the scope of the standard will give you a pretty good idea if that's going to apply or not. The only drawback that I hate about IEC and ISO, well, not the only, I should say, one of them, is that they have the scope, but the defined term like inflation is later than standard. So unless you really know what that scope is, it's hard to evaluate, is that standard going to fully apply or partly apply to my device sometimes, which is a struggle. So at that point, you may want to try to contact either a test lab or an independent consultant or some other standards development expert out there.
Yeah, and I was just made aware of this program that's at FDA recently, and I'll be honest, I didn't know it existed. But Scott, I don't know, I'm putting you on the spot here, but are you familiar with the DICE organization within FDA?
Yes, that's our consumer assistance group, and they're there to try to help answer, and if they can't answer, field questions that come in from any stakeholder, really.
Yeah,
and a lot of them end up coming towards the standards arena, because we're kind of a catch-all for a lot of different questions. But yeah, it's a very helpful resource that would use, and and a lot of times too, there's ways to contact different parts of the pre-market office to see if you need to come in and ask for some formal questions where you can get an official response back as well. And that's through the pre-submission process that is available. So if you're planning to do a 510K, but you're not quite sure of how certain things might apply, you may want to think earlier on in your development process about having a formal pre-submission come in, or QSUB as they call it. And that helps open up doors of communication and show that you're a responsible organization as well, that really care about trying to communicate what you've done and to kind of know as well what other things that you might need to do that aren't apparent in the standards area, or maybe what's listed in the guidance that might be a little bit older, and or your product has newer technologies, and you just need to figure out how can I apply these tools to get the right level of information to support a positive regulatory decision.
Yeah, those are really good tips. So, Scott, I know we're doing a webinar with you and with Leo later this year on the ASCA program, and I'm told ASCA is kind of a buzzword from FDA lately. Can you maybe explain a little bit about what ASCA is and what is significant with this new pilot program?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And we're really excited about this new program that we have, abbreviated under ASCA, ASCA. It stands for the Accreditation Scheme for Conformity Assessment. Overall, it's designed to improve the pre-market review process by increasing confidence in and reliance upon the declarations of conformity to certain FDA-recognized standards in a voluntary pilot program. I will say again, it is a pilot program. It's designed to figure out how can the agency improve its confidence and understanding and initiate new areas of communication with stakeholders that we don't regulate. And what I'm speaking to are the testing laboratory community, and when we're speaking about accreditation and accredited labs, the accreditation body in that community. We really have only experienced relationships and how products are tested to standards by going directly to the manufacturer. And with most manufacturers, as we know, being small manufacturers, less than 50 people, a lot of times testing is conducted in a third-party environment. And in many of those cases, those are an accredited organization. And we really have no appreciation or understanding of how that is impacted. And sometimes we don't even see how that's translated in a pre-market review submission. So the idea of this program is to capitalize upon the increasingly prominent role that standards play in regulatory science and practice, and work with accreditation bodies to help understand how are they determining that testing labs are competent underneath their scope of accreditation to the standards that we're trying to focus on, and try to see what we can do by building a relationship, providing information and even education to those laboratories, so that way when they go into contract with a manufacturer and are doing testing to certain standards, they have that perspective of what the regulatory agency is looking for and how things are tested. Because as we know in the 60601 world, that's not a standard that's written like a recipe in a cookbook. It has a lot of options out there for you to consider. And when you have to do that, we want to make sure that the labs are clearly able to provide a test report that reflects, how a manufacturer has defined their essential performance, for example, or why certain test methods were chosen over others, and how does that fit into the bigger picture so a manufacturer can take that information, make an appropriate declaration of conformity, and the agency having confidence in that approach of how the testing is done. What we're hoping for is, the need for consultations internally on the regulatory side. The request for complete test report reviews and additional information will diminish as our confidence in testing lab capabilities grows, and how manufacturers are appropriately utilizing those laboratories towards certain standards. And both FDA and manufacturers will benefit from the use of uniform declarations of conformity, with that ultimate goal. What we always speak to is that one test once, use everywhere.
Yeah, that's an exciting program. And folks, I encourage you to pay attention to what we're doing at Greenlight Guru, because as I mentioned, we are going to be doing a webinar later this year on the ASCA program with both Leo and Scott. And I guess, gentlemen, before we wrap up today's session, any last minute tips or pointers that you'd like to offer our audience in the meantime?
One I would bring up, which Scott and I have talked about many times, especially around the ASCA program, is that FDA has gotten more focused on essential performance of the 601 series of standards, including the basic or general standard 60601-1. And Scott mentioned briefly that they're looking at the test lab has looked at an analysis that the manufacturer has done, showing why there is or isn't essential performance. If there isn't, there better be really good justification, and that analysis will be looked at by the FDA, almost guaranteed. Because I've had several projects in the last 2 or 3 years, I think, that have come about just because of essential performance questions from the FDA. So that's one really big concept to be aware of, I think.
All right, great. Scott, any last minute tips or pointers for our listeners?
I think to add on to what Leo said, but it's just, kind of listen to what the whole theme of what everything's been talking about. The whole purpose of what we're trying to do is improve the relationship of how the agency understands and sees the appropriate use of how risk management is applied into the variety of different settings. And we know 60601 has a huge foundation around the use of ISO 14971 in risk management. But this goes across almost all standards, and really at the crux of how regulatory science for assessing substantial equivalence in safety and effectiveness is based upon the assessment of risk. And what we're really trying to do is improve the internal and external understanding of appropriately applying that both to standards as well as to just the overall process. And it kind of then allows us to use all the different resources better, whether it's using guidance documents or other standards that may or may not be cited within a parent standard. And so this is really part of that genesis. The idea of ASCA gets us involved in the areas of testing and the testing environment. We've been very much involved over several decades in the development of standards, and we have a great history of recognizing standards. We want to bring that up to the next level by doing the same thing with the relationship in the testing community, so we can help provide any perspective, but just as much of importance is understanding the rigors of what does an accreditation process entail, what does that mean for its quality of testing, and how data then can be used to help expedite regulatory decisions.
Terrific comments, Scott. And folks, I want to thank Scott Colburn. Scott is the Director of Standards and Conformity Assessment Program at FDA CDRH. And as you probably have picked up from Scott giving a kind of a glimpse of the ASCA pilot program, and if you've been paying attention to a lot of the other pilot programs that are in progress at the agency right now, this isn't new FDA. This isn't the FDA from 10 or even 5 years ago. It's a much more collaborative, much more progressive organization. And, it's really out there to try to bring new technologies to the market to help improve patients' lives. So, which is likely very much in alignment with what many of you are trying to do with the products that you're designing and developing. So FDA is very much a collaborative partner with industry these days. So pay attention to these pilot programs because they are out there to try to make life a little bit easier for all of us and ultimately help improve patients' lives. I also want to thank Leo Eisner. Folks, he is the IEC 60601 guy. If you have any questions about timing and the nuances and the specifics of 60601 and all the collateral standards that are impacted by that series, I would encourage you to reach out to Leo as well. You can find him very easily. Go to Eisner Safety, EISNER safety.com. and learn more about what he's doing. But gentlemen, thank you so much for being guests on the Global Medical Device Podcast today.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John. It's our pleasure.